恭喜发财，恭喜发财，and 恭喜发财，让我们开始。Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good night if you're about to sleep. Hi, my name is Phil, and welcome to another segment of Freaky Filipino Friday with Phil. Rar. And also, 祝你新年快乐, wishing you a happy Chinese New Year holidays. Now, today is Chinese Lunar New Year, and it's the year of the ox. Moo. And I hope it's gonna be a good year, because, last year was gonna be the well, to be sure, let's check out the feng shui in the internet, okay? So, lucky colors in 2021. Now, dominant and invigorating colors of 2021: white, gray, and silver. According to percepts of Chinese astrology and feng shui, metal, main element of the Chinese New Year 2021, symbolizes resistance, collective interest, determination, and persistence. So if you have that gray silver hair, so you're one step ahead. Today we're gonna talk about the Chinoys, or the Chinese Filipinos in the Philippines, and also some of the culture that influenced the Filipino culture. Though we have a Hispanic influence in our culture, and that's how most Filipinos portray, but hey, we have the Chinese culture, like tons, by the way. Like, hello, most of our celebrities are, Chinese, or in the Chinese ancestry to be exact. Now, the Filipino culture has tons of Chinese influence, and not a lot of people know it. Now, most of our dishes are derived from Chinese cuisine. To name a few: siopao, siomai, bami, lumpia, chop suey, hopia, kikiam, and the list goes on. So we'll talk about the history of the Chinoys, and it's a lot of information. I won't be very detailed, but I will try my best to explain as much, okay? So don't be mad if I miss out something or I make a mistake, because most likely I would make a mistake. But if I do make a mistake, just, comment down on the comment box below, as friendly as you can, okay? So I'll divide this video in different segments so I don't wander off when I talk, because, I tend to do that. So let's start with the different terms of the Chinese Filipinos. Now, first is Chinoys, which is Chinese-Pinoys, and it's divided into two categories: Chinito for the masculine form and Chinita for the feminine form. Now, there is also the Filipinong Insik, Incheck, or in Bisaya, Insik. Not insect like the bug, okay? But the old Spanish term for the Chinese was Sangley, but that is now obsolete, like no one used that anymore. It kind of sounds sophisticated, like a wine or a drink. Well, the Philippines have a huge portion of Filipinos having Chinese ancestry. Now, in 2013, there were approximately 1.35 million of these Filipinos with Chinese blood. I couldn't find any recent records of the total population of Filipinos with Chinese ancestry, but I'm pretty sure it's doubled, because we know we Filipinos reproduce like hamsters. Don't come after me, it's true. Now, by the way, the term Insik might be a derogatory form to some Filipino Chinese, especially in the older generation, because it had a link to, well, excuse me for the word, Chekwa, which means Chinese laborer, in a very discriminatory way, okay? But I will explain to you this in a while, okay? Now, this was used to make fun of Chinese in the old times, but over the years, the meaning changed. Now, many of the younger generation use the insik to identify themselves. And I know what you're thinking: where did this insik word came from? Well, it was believed that it was some sort of miscommunication between a Chinese merchant and a native Filipino. Well, according to stories, the Chinese merchant was introducing someone's uncle to this native Filipino, and he said "in check," which means his uncle. And after that, the Philippines considered them, the Chinese, as insik. And that is why communication is very important, guys, because you might label the whole community with something different. Hey, someone's uncle. If you know Mandarin, or at least familiar with Mandarin, Incheck doesn't sound Mandarin, right? Because majority of the Filipinos, they don't use Mandarin within their circle. So I'll tell you a little bit of myself, okay? So I studied in a double C school, Chinese Catholic school. Yeah, I know, it's a very uncommon combination. Now, we were taught to speak and write in Mandarin since I was a kid till my teenage years. Amazingly, I've learned nothing. Yes, I know, dishonor. Dishonor on your family, dishonor on your cow. But I can still remember the songs we used to sing. 一二三四五六七，我的朋友在哪里? Ah, memories. Ateneo de Cebu. Now back on track. Okay, we're wandering off again. Well, I'm a bit familiar with Mandarin, but when I hear my friends talking with their family, like, wait a minute, what was that? Chinese Filipinos use Hokkien or Hokkien or Amoy in the old term or the Xiamen dialect. Now, Mandarin and Hokkien are very different. For example, the older brother in Mandarin is Ke. Meanwhile, in Hokkien is Aya. Older sister in Mandarin is Jie. And in Hokkien, it's Ati. Now, Filipinos, why do they sound familiar? Well, prepare to get your minds blown. Aya, Kuya. Ati, Ate. And there are plenty of Filipino words that are actually Hokkien. You can just look it up in Google. Like for example, hikaw, okay, earrings. And I know you're wondering why Hokkien. Now let's proceed to history. As early as the 9th century, the ethnic Han Chinese have been sailing within Southeast Asia and interacting with Austronesian people, for example, us, Filipinos. The evidence of Chinese artifacts can be found throughout the Philippine waters. Now, the Chinese people who traveled in Southeast Asia are from the Minnan region. Now, it is found in the southeastern part of Fujian province in the southeastern China, where Hokkien is widely used as their lingua franca. Now, the Hokkien language is widely spoken in Southeast Asia also in the Chinese community. But in time, each area would develop their own linguistic structure of the Hokkien language, but it is still understandable within the community. When the Spaniards arrived in the 16th century, they have observed a number of Chinese population living in the Philippines, especially in the northern part. Because around that time, the city-states of the native Filipinos had a mutual relationship with the Ming dynasty, and they call this empire in the Philippines Luzon, or as we call it now, Luzon, which is why Luzon doesn't sound as Filipinos as Visayas and Mindanao. Well, actually, Visayas is kind of Hindu actually. It has its own history, but that's another video, okay? Now, the Spaniards wanted to expand their empire in the Philippines, and that requires a lot of laborers. Since there were a lot of Chinese living at that time, they hired them as laborers because they were more skilled when it comes to buildings, which is understandable, like, hello, Great Wall of China. And I think this is where the derogatory term comes from, the word Chekwa. Majority of the Chinese immigrants were living in Parian in Intramuros. The number of Chinese population grew rapidly, and also the Chinese Filipinos. Now the Spaniards, colonizers as they are, do what they do best, to colonize. Okay, Chinese people, you're living in our lands now. You're all gonna change your names into Spanish, okay? Mi amor. Same as the Filipinos, a lot of Chinese had to change their last names into Spanish. Now, some of these examples are Lopez, Laurel, Rizal, Osmeña, and so on and so forth. Some of the Chinese didn't like this, so they kinda Chinesed their last names. I don't know if that's a real term, Chinese, or they simply changed their last names into Spanish sounding. Some examples are Lacson, Tuazon, Ongpin, Yuchenko, Quebenco, Quangco, Kuyenkeng, Yapchichay, Yunchenko, Tiongson, Wanchu, and so on and so forth. Now, the Spaniards were not contented. They noticed that there were a lot of interbreeding going on, not just the Chinese and Filipinos alone, but also the Spaniards. Now, the chicos guapos were mingling with the native chicas hermosas, so they were threatened. So in my last video, Are Filipinos Hispanic?, I talked briefly about the casta system to categorize different races basing on one's heritage and skin color. This will determine what job you can have and also a certain amount of privilege you can receive, which is still kind of true, by the way. And I'm not just talking about the Philippines. You know what I'm saying? World. So they first categorized the native Austronesians as Indios, which where I would be if I was still living in the past. While the people with pure Chinese ancestry were called Sangley, but the people who are mixed Austronesian and Chinese were called Mestizo de Sangley. Voila, Chinitos and Chinitas. And the person with mixed Spanish Austronesian and Chinese ancestry were called Tornatras. So they have already the caste system, but the Spanish were like, not enough. They wanted the Chinese to convert into Catholicism. And the Chinese were like, you can't make us. By this time, the Spaniards still needed the Chinese because the economy around that time was highly dependent on the Chinese immigrants, not just for labor but also traders and artisans. But they still want them to come into their own terms. So they established a huge town called Binondo, which serves as a settlement for them. So they made a deal. If they, the Chinese, would convert themselves as Catholics, not only that they would have their own land, they will also have limited self-governing privileges and tax-free. Like, wow, that's a good deal already. Let's go. So the Spaniards made this deal first to a group of Chinese merchants and artisans because this was a business transaction, and this is how the oldest Chinatown was created. Binondo. Of course, outside China, the relationship between the Chinese and the Spaniards were not really that peaceful as you think. There had numerous battles between the Chinese and the Spaniards, so the first encounter of the Spaniards authorities with Chinese immigrants were actually pirates. Arr. In 1574, the pirates led by Li Feng or Li Mang Hong tried to capture the city of Manila from the Spaniards. Now our friend here, Li Mang Hong, was actually an expelled warlord from China in a battle of Guangdong because he noticed that Luzon was a favorite trading spot for Southeast Asian countries, China and Japan. Well, he decided to go there. So he hijacked a ship so he could ambush and attack to Manila. But when he arrived there were Spaniards. Surprise, motherfuckers. So long story short, Li Mang Hong fled back. Well, he had quite a story though, but you can search it up because he had his own adventures in the Philippines. Now, there were also revolts happening within Manila. The next commotion was in 1603. Now this time, this is a dark event in the Chinese community in the Philippines. In 1603, the Ming Dynasty sent a fleet to the Philippines. Now, the Chinese officials told the Spaniards that they were looking for a mountain of gold because they heard that Philippines has a mountain of gold. Well, which was true by the way, but they could have picked Visayas because people back there were just wearing gold and being fashionable about it. But they ended up in Manila instead. The Spaniards were surprised and threatened because the Ming Dynasty fleet outnumbered the Spaniards. The Spaniards were like, nope, we don't have gold here, and we take care of the Chinese people here. And they just left without a question. And after what happened, the Spaniards were suspicious. You know, the Chinese people are up to something. But at the same time, without knowing what happened, the Chinese community was planning a revolt against the Spaniards. So as soon as they started the revolt, the Spaniards killed them off. They massacred a total of 20,000 Chinese that composed the colony. The Spaniards then burned Parian down, where most of the Chinese who joined the revolt came from, because there was a big division of Chinese people. Those who decided to be converted were granted to live in Binondo, while those who refused stayed in Parian. And after what happened, the Chinese community just stayed quiet, and because they were threatened by the Spaniards. If you ever misbehave, you will be rolled like the lumpias you're making. So the Chinese community are focused on retail trade and service industry to avoid massacre and forced deportation to China, to prove themselves that they are an essential part of the society. And after that, the Spaniards became stricter with the Chinese. So the Chinese had low chance of employment and they were prohibited to own a land. 3 decades later, the Chinese community rebuilt Parian again, but this sparked fear to the Spaniards. Like, they just fear almost everything. So they came up with a decree to round up unmarried Chinese men in Parian, and the ones married to Filipinos will stay in Binondo. They had only few Chinese women that time, and this is to keep the population in Parian very low because they didn't want a revolt again. Now, this was also implemented in the Visayas region, especially Iloilo, Camarines Sur, and also especially Cebu, where I live. Like, each of them, they have their own Parian. Now, after the Spanish era, huge Chinese immigrants came into the Philippines. And around that time, the Americans were already taking over. During the American colonial era, the Chinese Exclusion Act in the US was also put in effect in the Philippines. Now, this means the Chinese Exclusion Act was a United States federal law signed by President Chester A. Arthur on May 6, 1882. Now, this prohibited all immigration of Chinese laborers. There was a sudden huge influx of Chinese migrants coming in. As the Americans were ruling over the Philippines, crazy things were happening in China. Starting from Taiping Rebellion, Chinese Civil War, and Boxer Rebellion that led to the fall of the Qing dynasty. Which led to thousands of Chinese from Fujian province in China to migrate in big bulks to the Philippines because people back in China were getting poor and then they were afraid of political persecution. I bothered to ask my friends about their Chinese ancestry. Most of their grandparents or great-grandparents moved during this time because the original Sangley have already interbred with the Filipinos. Thus, their children are heavily mixed over time, which explains that there are a lot of Filipinos that look Chinese but they don't know if they are really Chinese. The ones with a very strong Chinese bloodline came later after the Spanish era. Though the Chinese were prohibited to go into the Philippines, the Chinese community in the Philippines looked for a way that they could come in. For instance, they would declare to the authorities that these were their relatives and were then allowed to enter the country afterwards. Thinking like a Filipino. Love it. Around this time, a lot of Chinese have already identified themselves as Filipinos. But again, another occurrence happened. During 1975 to 1986, Chinese were considered as aliens under the Marcos administration. Under the administration of Ferdinand Marcos, Chinese Filipino who have citizenship referred only to those who arrived in the country before World War II, and they are called Laucao. And those who arrived after the war were later called Chukiao, and most of them were residents who came from China via Hong Kong in the 1950s to the 1980s. This phase was kind of a bit similar to the Spanish era. The Chinese couldn't own a business or even own a land unless they changed their last names into Filipino or Spanish names. And around this time, the Chinese community was heavily submerged. But there was hope. Following the February 1986 People Power Revolution EDSA number 1, the Chinese Filipinos quickly gained national spotlight as Cory Aquino, a Kapampangan Chinese Filipino mestiza of the Chinese ancestry from the influential Huangco family, took up the presidency. Since then, the Chinese culture has been part of the Filipino culture for a very, very long time. Honestly saying, it's quite hard to pinpoint which is really a Chinese culture or a native Filipino culture, because now it kind of goes hand in hand, especially in the Filipino household. Superstitions, food, linguistic, but that's life. That's our culture. And that was a long historical talk again. It's not really detailed, okay? But if I would put it into details, it will take forever. I could write a book. I would like to thank my best friends for helping me out because most of them are Chinese. Of course, really thank you. Love ya. And this video is really dedicated for you guys because, you've been part of my life and the Chinese culture has been part of my life also, even though I'm not really Chinese, but well, I still grew up with it, okay? Before we end, I would like to say Happy Chinese New Year again. Stay safe, be freaky, and 谢谢你, okay? And goodbye, of course. Bye-bye.